The following podcast is created and sponsored by High Beam Ministry.
When you go into a coffee shop and you're just personable, be friendly and courteous the entire time.
That's when I really appreciate the customer.
If I have a really interesting conversation with someone while I'm behind the bar, I will give them a free drink because I'm enjoying their company, and that to me is what coffee is for.
You know when someone's having a rough day just by the way that they carry themselves. And if you can do anything as a barista to make that better, then great.
If you're on your phone, it's all out the window.
Hang up your phone!
You are inviting me to ask the person behind you what they want.
Welcome to the Ersatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah,
where are those cups? We ran out at the kiosk over at Big Brain University.
You're going over to the Big Brain University again?
Oh, yeah. Well, we set up that little kiosk over there.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so much fun talking to these college students, man. They just love getting in and really wrestling for some of these ideas from the Bible. And, it's fun being challenged, It really helps you think.
It does. Since the last time you were in, then we had a chance to discuss. We need to kind of summarize our conversation. But, Jay, I heard a Bible teacher just say this week about prophecy, and he was trying to describe prophecy and sort of put it in an understandable example. And what he said is it's like standing at a foot of a mountain range and looking across all of the mountains in the distance, and you can see the peaks of the mountains, and they're identifiable by their shape and so forth and so on. But what you don't ever see is the distance between those mountain peaks because you don't see the valleys.
You're right.
What do you think about that?
That's, I think, a great description of it. When my family took a trip out west, it was amazing because you'd see the Rocky Mountains in the distance. And I'm thinking, I'm just about to the mountains. And man, it took a long time to reach them going across Colorado. It's just, wow, I thought we were right on top of them, but it took a long time to get there.
Yeah.
And then once we were there, I thought, we'll just go over this mountain peak and, there's another one. Took a long time to get to that one, too. And that really is a lot like prophecy because we get the mountaintop identification points in prophecy. That would be like the main point of what each prophet is trying to say when we're talking foretelling. But man, we don't know how long it's going to take.
Well, I think then that's why so often it's very difficult to pinpoint, identify exactly A, B, and C how some of these things are going to play out because there is time and there's distance and, all of those things.
Well, it's kind of like a roadmap, too. I mean, you've got the roadmap and then you have what your eyes see and you don't know where you are on the roadmap until you get past that point. Sometimes you see the sign or you see some sort of a landmark and you go, this is where we're at. Based on what we were talking about last week, that's really the case because in talking about prophecy, you have to be able to understand so many things in order to identify where you're at in the prophetic timeline. For example, when Jesus was talking, about the Olivet Discourse, and the disciples asked a couple of questions. They said, when is this temple going to be torn down, like you said? What's the sign of the end, and what's the sign of your coming? And Jesus launches out and says, this is what's going to happen in the near future. And he describes these things to the disciples. And then he says, this is just the beginning of the birth pangs. Okay, birth pangs being these prophetic events, these end-time turmoils, okay, things indicating Messiah's approach. And then he says, and all this stuff is going to happen, but the end is not yet. So you get this indicator, this some kind of an interim thing. So you're in a valley here. And the problem is you don't know how long it's going to be. Imagine, he's saying this to the disciples. They think the kingdom of the Messiah's kingdom is going to start with like right now or in a couple of years. In fact, when Paul writes, his writing is like, hey, stay fast, guys, because Jesus could come right around the corner. Well, now here we are about 1,900 years later, 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting. What a valley that is.
I was just going to say, what a distance that valley is. But as we move forward now, because what you talked about last week was so good about when is the end, and you talked about the temple and so forth. You know, I really want to tell you, Truth Barista, I'm so glad you're doing these talks with me because there's so many loose ends in prophecy. And you sort of take all those loose ends and tie it together. And really that's what people need. They know a little bit here, a little bit there, but how does it fit? Connecting the dots is so very important.
It is. And we try our best. But I got to tell you, before we launch into this, Paul says that we see through a glass darkly, which means we only understand partly when we're looking ahead. So the best we can do is look at the most identifiable things and then speculate the best we can. But all prophecy, I believe, is best judged looking backwards. So as we go past a point in history, you can go, oh, this is that which Jesus prophesied. This is that which was written. Until then, one of the phrases I always love to use with my friends is, I'll let you know when I get there. So people go, who's the Antichrist? I'll let you know when we get there. What is this beast kingdom? Is it a revived Roman Empire? Is it Europe? Is it Germany? Is it an Islamic nation? Is it what? I'll let you know when we get there because we'll be able to lock it into the puzzle of the map. Okay? So let's go ahead. Last week we left off with the verse where Jesus says, and this good news of the kingdom of heaven will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. Okay, so what does that mean? And then the end will come. Well, now we need to go into the next verse. Verse 15 of Matthew 24. Do you have your Bible over there?
I do.
Okay, well, open that bad boy up there and get me a cup of Joe, and I'll start working through this here. Okay, so verse 15. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, and I love this, it's a little parenthesis that apparently somebody has inserted in the text when Matthew wrote it. Now, either Matthew put it in or somebody put it in later on. It says, let the reader understand. Well, what does that mean? It's a perfect key to prophecy. You have to go back and know Daniel in order to understand what Jesus is referring to. See, if you and I know something, all I have to do is just basically say, Harley. And you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, you're trading in your Harley.
Yes, I am.
There you go. But most of the people listening have no idea what I'm referring to. Well, Jesus often teaches in shorthand, and that was very common by rabbis of the day. So he's saying, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, what should we do? We should go back to Daniel. Okay, so let's walk through some of our principles. What's the time frame Jesus was talking about? Well, verse 14, and then the end will come. That introduces it. We're at the end. All right? Now, we also know that we're at the end because the event called the abomination that causes desolation is a specific event that's prophesied by Daniel.
So the abomination is something that is really against God. So this is a huge offense to God.
Right.
The abomination.
The abomination. So for example, let's do this. Well, we're going to talk about this in a second, but there was an evil king from Greece who took over Israel. And what he did is he desecrated the temple. The temple is a very holy place where God's presence is. It's a very holy place. And what God has set apart or to himself made holy is a very special place. It's sacred. Well, there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do in this area. And one of the things that is a great abomination to God is you cannot serve another God. So to set up, for example, an idol in the temple precincts, whether it's in the temple or in the temple walls or on the Temple Mount, regardless of what it is an abomination to God because it absolutely is the greatest offense that you can bring against God. It's a high-level thing, okay?
So the abomination is what it is, and desolation is what it does.
Exactly. Wonderful point. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, the first one answered, when will these things happen, the temple being torn down? The second stage answers the question, what is the sign of the end of the age? And the third question is going to be, what is the sign of your coming? Okay, so let's go to the second one here. It's indicated by the abomination that causes desolation, or the abominate that desolates what? Well, God's holy place. So now you have to go back to Daniel. Well, where is this said in Daniel? It's mentioned in Daniel 7, it's mentioned in Daniel 8, and you also have to go, I believe, in Daniel 9. Okay, so Daniel 7 talks about a beastly kingdom that will exist just before this Son of Man, as he's called, Jesus, as we know him, returns. Now, this is obviously the end. Why? This is the picture in Daniel 7. Daniel is taken up and he sees a picture of heaven, and here's the Ancient of Days, God, sitting on a throne, and there's fire, and this mysterious person called the Son of Man steps forward. Son of Man is a Hebraic way or a biblical way of saying this is somebody who is human and appears human, but the odd part is what is this human being doing in heaven? That's a place of the spiritual world. Okay, so this has to be a divine human being. This Son of Man steps forward, receives a scroll. Actually, what it is dominion from the Ancient of Days. He comes, he destroys the beast kingdom, and sets up his own kingdom that will last forever. This should sound really familiar to a lot of people, because in the last couple programs we talked about human dominion will last until a specific point. Then it will become the dominion of God over his creation that will last forever. Right in the middle of those two sections, you have one point called the Day of the Lord. So this Son of Man appears with a bunch of clouds. He receives the right to rule from the Ancient of Days. He steps in, destroys the human beast kingdom, this beastly kingdom, whatever it is, and then he sets up God's kingdom. That's Daniel 7.
And just to clarify, I want to make sure that the Ancient of Days is what? Because if somebody doesn't understand that language, you go, who the heck is the Ancient of Days?
Right. Anybody knowing the entire Bible realizes the Ancient of Days is God sitting on his throne. Sometimes we'd call that God the Father. We'll see later, because, once again, Revelation unfolds. So we know that here's God sitting on his throne, handing a dominion over humanity to the Son of Man, a human that is somehow in heaven. He appears with clouds. Hold that picture. By the way, Larry, this is really an important key to understanding the Bible. It was written by Jews. It was written by people with a Hebraic mindset. The Hebraic mindset thinks in concrete pictures. So if you want a good key to interpretation, look at the pictures. The pictures lock the puzzle together. It's like a picture in a puzzle piece that you connect one to another, and eventually you get the whole thing. Okay, Daniel 8. This is another picture. Prophecy comes to prophets in pictures often. Daniel sees a picture of a ram and a goat, and this describes a future battle between two empires. And actually, the angel gives Daniel the interpretation. He says, this is Persia and Greece, okay? Depicted as a ram and a goat, Greece being the goat. It describes a horn that grows up on this goat. What this means is, in, I guess, the language of the day, a horn is a symbol of strength and often represents a king.
It's like the alpha goat.
Yeah. So you have a horn that grows on this goat's head. That's a king that's coming forth who is going to exercise rule and authority. Now, this king, if you read through Daniel 8:11 through 12, he will rise up after a period of time on this goat, and he is going to rise up and cause havoc with Israel. Now, if you understand history, which is really an important part of unlocking prophecy, you'll realize that this prophecy follows the pattern of Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes. He's an important character. Let me put this, you know your history? You know your Greek history?
Well, somewhat, but what I'm getting out of this is almost as if to say that history has clues to the future.
Exactly.
So you have to go back and get the clues in order to interpret the future.
That's what we're doing. We're collecting the clues.
Got it.
One of the clues here is out of this Greek empire is going to rise a nasty king, and he's going to wreak havoc on Israel. Now, Alexander the Great was the guy that got the Greek empire going. He died in 323, I believe. About 150 years later, after his kingdom had split into four parts, one being Greece, one Macedonia, huge section in the Syrian area of today, and a huge one down in Egypt. The Seleucids controlled the Syrian section, The Ptolemies, Cleopatra being part of that, controlled the Egypt side of that Greek Empire. And this North Kingdom and South Kingdom, I mean, they fought all the time. Well, the problem is if you're traveling from Syria down to Egypt, guess where you're crossing? Israel. If you're going from Egypt to attack Syria, you're crossing Israel. So Israel literally is caught between these two kingdoms. Well, on his way south, a king called Antiochus IV Epiphanes gets into Israel and looks at these Jews and he says, you know, we can't just have these Jews being Jews. We need them to be Greeks. So what did he do? He outlawed Judaism. And he started the horrible things. If you studied a Torah scroll, you were killed. If you had a baby and circumcised it, he would take the babies, kill them, and make the mothers wear them around their neck. That's how horrible this guy was. I know. Yeah, I saw you slide your coffee away. Okay, I'll try to make it a little less graphic here. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, he forbade Judaism. The key or the heart of Judaism is the temple, and he desecrated it. He raised a statue to Zeus in the temple, and then he sacrificed a pig on Israel's God's altar, Jehovah's altar. The pig is a non-kosher, unclean, spiritually unacceptable animal. This is an abomination. It's not only idolatry, but you're offering an unclean, yucky, bleh animal to God. This is an abomination. And what did it do? It desecrated the sanctuary, the temple. Now does this begin to make sense? Okay, so we have to know the culture and the practices in which this is written. Now, when he did this, he also did something else. Once you've desecrated the altar, you can no longer have the required sacrifices. The sacrifice day starts with a lamb offering at 9 o'clock and a lamb offering at 3 p.m. This is called the daily or the daily sacrifice. The Hebrew word is tamid. You can't have the other sacrifices in the middle unless you start it with the tamid and you end it with the tamid. Everything is bookend between those two. Do you follow me so far?
I do. Okay.
Okay. So what happens is if he stops the tamid at the beginning at 9 o'clock, you can't have the rest of the sacrificial day. The sacrifices have been stopped. So the abomination that desolates, which is setting up this image and sacrificing an unclean thing on the altar and stopping the sacrifices, this is the thing. This is the sign that Jesus is referring to when he says, when you see the abomination that desolates, as written by Daniel or prophesied by Daniel, let the reader understand. This is an interesting thing because he's referring back to Daniel, who is prophesying something to come that has already happened by the time you get to Jesus' day, but Jesus' day saying, at the end, it's going to happen again.
Well, it's similar to like what Jesus said, that last days will be like the days of Noah. He's going back also and saying, just like the days of Noah, what happened in their day, unawareness and unconcern, is going to happen again. Totally ignorant of what God was doing.
Yep.
So very interesting.
And as there was wickedness all over the earth and violence in men's heart and bloodshed, he said that's going to be the hallmark of the end as well.
So the next desolation, abomination, will happen with another ruler then, is that correct?
Right. It's going to be, let's put it this way, Antiochus IV is the pattern.
Right.
Okay, what's interesting about Antiochus IV is his nickname, Epiphanes. Now, if you're a church person, you know that Epiphany means the manifestation of God. It's a Christian feast day marking when Jesus was presented in baptism. Okay, this is Epiphany. Well, his name in Epiphanies means God manifested. He's claiming to be God in the flesh. Isn't that interesting? Because Jesus is God in the flesh, so he is an anti-God in the flesh. Okay, if Jesus is God in the flesh and he's the Messiah, which in Greek is Christ, he is a picture of an anti-Christ. That's the connection here.
I see.
And this guy is going to do this. Verse 11. It, the horn, made itself great, even up to the prince of the host, referring to God. It removed his daily sacrifice, that word is tamid, and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Verse 12, and because of rebellion, a host, together with the daily sacrifice, will be given over. What happened? There was a rebellion among the Jews. Many of them were slaughtered. But eventually, with God's help, they drove out the Greeks, and Antiochus IV died shortly thereafter. Okay, now we have to make a big jump here. Now we have a time frame. So jump to Daniel 9:27.
Okay.
It talks about the end in 9:26, and it says this: it will be marked, the end, by a 7-year covenant which will be broken in the middle. The last 3.5 years of human dominion on earth are going to be absolutely hellacious. It's going to be hell on earth. This breaking point, Jesus said, is going to be marked. Well, actually, Daniel says this breaking point will be marked by stopping of sacrifices and an abomination that desolates the temple precinct. In other words, in 8, Daniel's prophesying about Antiochus. In 9, he's saying the same thing is going to happen at the end. And Jesus, in his message, says, guess what? What Daniel prophesied is the pattern, and it's going to happen at the end.
So we know when we're talking about this that it's going to happen again. There has to be a temple and there has to be sacrifices in order for them to stop.
Okay, what we do know is we do know there has to be sacrifices.
Okay.
We do know there has to be some image set up if it's to follow Antiochus's pattern. And by the way, in the book of Revelation, it talks about this beast setting up an image or having an image set
Right.
up. Okay, so there's the pattern linking together. Look at the pictures. This is what it says in Daniel. He, referring to this person, will make a firm covenant, and that means enforce a covenant, with many for 1 week. That's a phrase in the language. It's 1 week is 7 sevens or 7 years, Shavuot. But in the middle of the week, 3.5 years in, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and offering. Maybe this covenant allows the Jewish people to begin sacrificing on the Temple Mount again. Whether that includes a temple or not, doesn't say. But we do know that if you start seeing somebody allowing Jewish sacrifices according to the Torah up on the Temple Mount, you can pretty much bet we have entered really, really close to the end. And by the way, even if it's one sacrifice and this person stops it, it qualifies.
Well, I always thought, Jaya, why is it so important for the Jews to start the sacrifices again? I mean, they've lived 2,000 years without it. What's the deal?
Because it's prophesied, and number 2, the Torah commands it. So here's the idea. If the opportunity arises, and there are some in Israel today that are pushing for this, they want a third temple built, they want to do a Passover sacrifice on the altar. The Temple Mount Institute has already been training priests. They've already been preparing for the sacrificial service. The sacrificial service is important to Judaism in the Torah because it has the whole idea of cleansing people, forgiving their sins. They need that. And some Jewish people say, no, we don't need that. We've changed it. Well, you can change it rabbinically all you want and saying that good works equate for sacrifices. No, if it's Torah observant, the Torah says this is what it must be. Okay, so right now, because of the Muslim occupation of the Temple Mount and the control of the Temple Mount, that's impossible. So is this prophecy fulfilled? Somehow there's got to be an opening made.
Now, you talk about the Temple Mount. It's always important to clarify and define. What do you mean by the Temple Mount? Why is that so important? Can't they build a temple somewhere else?
Well, God said that you're going to put the temple where the place where my name is. What's fascinating, if you look at the topography of Jerusalem, there are 3 valleys that intersect at the bottom. And I give you the name, but who cares?
Yeah.
You know? But if you look at it, and it makes what looks like a W. Well, in the Hebrew language, that W is the letter Shin or Sin, depending on where the dot is placed over the W. Well, if you put the dot on the right-hand side of the letter, which is where the temple would have been on the easternmost ridge, it would make it a Shin. That is the Shin letter for Shem, which means name. If you look at the topography, that W is the same W that's on the mezuzah that's stuck on people's doors that represents God's name, Shaddai, or the Almighty One, the provider who gives you everything you need. So here, God's name is literally, his initial is stamped right where Jerusalem is built. And so when David lived there, he says, where do I build this temple? The angel of the Lord was standing over the threshing floor of Ornan and said, this is the place. By the way, that hill is also Mount Moriah, where Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac. So here's another prophecy
What
thing.
rich history.
Isn't that cool? Here's the pattern. God set the pattern in Abraham for a prophecy to be fulfilled later in Jesus in the same area. We might, I got to run down to the kiosk. We should probably pick this up later because I got to get these things down here.
Wow. Well, give us just a quick nugget here to go out on so we can pick it up next time.
Okay. Keep your eyes open. If you're going to accurately interpret prophecy, you have to understand what happened in the past. You have to understand culture, history, all this stuff. And then you have to keep your eyes open. Because right now, are we at the end? I don't see sacrifices going on the Temple Mount. I don't see an image being set up. I do see world conditions shaping up like Jesus prophesied, but the thing that he's talking about are very specific. He started broad and he's narrowing the focus. He started short term and he's moving toward the end.
Life is fragile no matter the age. God has given us life, and all life will end someday. Do you know what happens when life ends? Jesus told us that death is not to be feared because he has control over it. Anyone who has the control over death is the one I want to know. How about you? Thanks for joining us.
This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast. The best way to find out when a new podcast drops is through RSS feed. Go to our website, look for the RSS button, press it, and then enter your email. You'll be notified when a new podcast drops. Thanks for listening.